Good afternoon and welcome to the Royal Society of Edinburgh and its Curious programme. My name is Michael Keating. I'm a professor at the University of Aberdeen, but more to the point here, I'm the General Secretary of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Curious is a summer programme that we have, which is a set of talks, discussions, debates, exhibitions about the work of the Society, which spans the whole area of natural sciences, the social sciences, the arts, the humanities, and culture. And the idea is to engage with the public, with people like you, to bring new ideas to bear, to discuss and debate issues facing modern society. Today's topic is a very topical one, that is the immigration and asylum policy of the UK government and its implications, particularly for Scotland. The government has just passed, it's in the process of passing, I think, its new asylum bill. It's highly controversial. There are some issues that may bear particularly on Scotland, so we'll have a Scottish angle to this. To discuss these ideas, we have four speakers here. They're all associated one way or another with the Royal Society of Edinburgh. In the order that I've got them here, they are Christina Boswell, who is the Professor of Politics at the University of Edinburgh and is a long-standing scholar on questions of migration, asylum policy, and has worked with governments on these questions. We have Dylan Fotoohi, who is the Programme Manager at Migration Exchange and founder of Refugees for Justice. Christina is a fellow of the Royal Society, I should say. Dylan is a member of the Young Academy of Scotland, which is part of the Royal Society. We have Alison Phipps, a professor at the University of Glasgow, UNESCO Chair on Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts. And we have Joe Shaw, a professor of law at the University of Edinburgh and the Salveson Chair of European Institutions in the university there. We're going to try and raise a few issues which we want to share with you this afternoon. There's no question of covering the whole topic, which is so vast, but the speakers have been talking amongst themselves and deciding what they might want to emphasize. I've given them strict orders that they should take no more than 28 minutes between them, because the most important aspect of this is talking to you, the members of the public, and finding out what you know, what you want to know, how you can contribute to that debate. So we've got 7 minutes each just to set the scene, just to say one or two things, and then I want to open it up. You can contribute your questions in the Q&A section there, which you'll find on the website. So while they're speaking, after they're speaking, you may have ideas already. Just put your questions up there, because we want to leave plenty of time for you to engage in the discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to go over to the speakers in the order in which I've just indicated them. And if I remembered right, the first one was Christina, 7 minutes.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Michael. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical context of this immigration plan, and my research has focused quite heavily on the Home Office as an organisation and sort of thinking and organisational beliefs and culture within the Home Office since at least the 1980s or so. And central to my input is going to be the concept of bluff. Now, bluff, if you look up at the dictionary definition, is an attempt to deceive someone into believing that one can or is going to do something. And bluff, as I'm going to suggest, is very central in Home Office culture and thinking. And it's not a phrase that I coined to refer to the Home Office. It's a phrase that emerged from an interview which I conducted with a former official there who talked about bluff being endemic to immigration control. And I'm going to come back to that thought in a minute. But just very briefly on the historical context. So until the mid to late 1980s, very few asylum seekers made it to the UK. The number of asylum seekers was in the hundreds. And it was really in the late 1980s, for a number of reasons I won't go into now, that the number of people claiming asylum on reaching the UK, particularly at airports, began to increase, so that by the early 1990s, there were roughly 40,000 asylum applications per year, rising to a peak of around 84,000 main applicants in 2002. And that number then steadily came down, so that more recently we've seen numbers at around 30 or 40,000 again. So just that context is always very, very important. I'm sure other speakers will mention that too, that actually there was a peak in asylum seeking in the early 2000s, but actually that has considerably reduced over the last few years. Now, the issue for the Home Office, and I'm very much trying to get into this sort of mindset, if one can, of the Home Office, was that once in the UK, the process of applying and making a decision on asylum could take months or years. And over that time, people might abscond from the process, so they might sort of disappear from the process, or might, after following a negative decision on their asylum application, might refuse to return. And the Home Office faced huge challenges in trying to deport people whose asylum applications had been rejected. And there are a number of complicated reasons for that, but quite often there would be legal challenges to return or deportation. There would be difficulties ascertaining what country somebody had come from or travelled through, or the country of origin might not recognise them as a national. So the Home Office faced these dilemmas because it wanted to be robust for political reasons on control and keep numbers down, but struggled to do so. And so the response of both Conservative and Labour governments over these decades was to introduce a range of restrictions, and you'll be familiar with the sort of repertoire of restrictions, I'm sure, making asylum processes more restrictive, reducing support for asylum seekers, a ban on employment, trying out the vouchers instead of cash payments as support, dispersal, and so on. And this wasn't just the UK. This was sort of typical range of approaches across European countries. But this is really where the bluff comes in. And I want to quote a little bit, sort of slightly more length, from the respondent to this interview. He said, "You make these firm pronouncements that only these categories of people are going to qualify and everybody else will have to go home, but you know that ultimately it's only a small proportion who are going to be compelled to go. The more you can make the bluff work, the more people will say, okay, enough's enough, I've had my decision, I realise I've got to go, I will go. We always knew that it was a small proportion of the refusals who ended up being deported. I suppose it was a mixture of complacency and bluff. Bluff is endemic to immigration control." So what is this bluff? Just briefly on two levels. So first of all, bluff captures a very strong and entrenched organisational belief in the Home Office about deterrence. So the idea is, if you send out a clear signal, the UK isn't a soft touch, potential asylum seekers won't get sort of generous treatment, it's very difficult to get asylum, you won't be allowed to stay, you're going to be deported, you're going to be sent, there's no point. If you send out that strong deterrence message, then that will sort of do the job of reducing numbers. Now, the reason the UK has fallen back on this deterrence approach is because, unlike continental European countries, the UK has a very limited, and traditionally has had a very limited, infrastructure for internal control. So there isn't a system of central registration, there aren't ID cards, there aren't regular spot checks and so on. So instead of that kind of more continental style of immigration control, you compensate with a very restrictive message. Think go home vans. You send out a signal and hope that deters people. And that was also very much emerging in the context of European cooperation around the time, and ideas about country shopping. So the erroneous, in my view, belief that people somehow are sort of shopping around to see, where's the best place to apply for asylum. Now, this notion of deterrence does not have an evidence base. So I think, although it's a strong organisational belief on the part of the Home Office, there is no research that suggests that Home Office actions and policies and legislation have a clear, linear, causal effect on decisions of people. And I'm sure that other speakers will talk in more detail about that. If anything, it's things like language, historical ties, networks, family and kin who are already in the UK that might influence choice of country, but also what the opportunities are for actually travelling to a particular destination. And often asylum seekers and refugees face very limited options there. But just ending on the second aspect of bluff. So we've talked about bluff in the context of deterrence, so as a signal to try to deter asylum seekers, but bluff is also about domestic audiences. It's about voters. So it's about sending a political signal to potential voters, to electorates, that the government is being very tough on immigration and that it's going to restrict asylum and immigration. So it's sort of the ultimate form of symbolic politics. You signal a restrictive approach, even if in practice you can't fully implement it. And you can imagine why this type of bluff would be especially important for the current government, for our current Home Secretary, Priti Patel. Bluff because it's very important to highlight the restrictionist agenda of the government to appeal to particular sectors of the electorate, and bluff because more than ever the UK is actually constrained in its ability to implement enforcement. So in the absence of the Dublin Convention, which was the EU convention for deciding which European country was responsible for processing asylum applications, in the absence of being part of EU readmission agreements, the UK actually has very little tools now at its disposal for trying to enforce asylum and immigration policy goals. So more than ever, it falls back on bluff. And bluff isn't just about signalling, it also has real world implications. So I talk about bluff as if it's purely symbolic. Bluff actually means that poor decisions will be made with consequences for people's lives and with consequences for the public debate. I think I'll leave it there. I hope I've been within my time and hand over to one of my colleagues on the panel.
Perfect timing, Christina. We set a good example. So next we have Dylan.
Thanks, Michael and Christina, and hello, everyone. I try to spend my time to focus on Scotland and what immigration asylum policy and legislation means now for Scotland and what the new bill is potentially going to introduce to the Scottish context. I think there are two general ways of looking at asylum and immigration, one of which is used and adapted by the UK government, and the other one is intended by Scottish government. And there's a discrepancy between these two approaches. In Scotland, as you probably all of you know, there is we have the New Scot integration strategy, which is built on the philosophy and the approach that the sooner and the earlier and the quicker and the easier we make it for people to integrate into the society, the better for everyone, the healthier society we have, and the more humane approach we have to humans who are subject to the system. And that's a very rational approach. The New Scot strategy focuses on all the different domains of integration. So in order to facilitate and support people to integrate better into society and rebuild their lives and contribute to society as healthy citizens, it focuses on different domains of integration: employment, housing, health, education, financial support, social connection, citizenship. And it intends to facilitate people's access to those domains of integration, and therefore supporting their integration starting from day one. So starting integration from day one is Scotland's approach to integration of asylum seekers. Now, in practice, what we have, the discrepancy that exists between this approach and the legal frameworks that is imposed on people who are subject to the system is this. The other way of looking at asylum seekers and asylum integration in general is the approach that underlies and informs the UK government's treatment towards asylum seekers, which is the more restriction we impose on people, the more difficult we make it for people to access their rights and entitlements, the more we discourage other people to come to the UK. That's a false assumption to begin with, in my personal experience of going through the process and traveling to the UK to seek asylum in the UK. That's a false assumption that the more difficult you make it for people to integrate, the more you encourage others to come here. And as Christina mentioned, this is not based on evidence and research, this assumption. But regardless of the assumption, that's the approach. So the discrepancy and the contradiction between this approach makes it difficult for Scotland as a society, as a nation, and Scottish government to implement its intention to social integration. For example, think about employment as an example. It doesn't matter how much you recognize employment is important for people's integration and well-being, and it doesn't matter how much you research and recognize it's better for people to enter the job market as soon as possible because it's better for the society, for people to work and pay tax and rebuild their lives. If by law people's access to the job market is restricted, people are denied access to the job market, people are not allowed to work, your intention doesn't really matter. And same thing applies to housing and homelessness services, to public services, to education, to public funds, to employment. So the point that I'm trying to make is, at the moment in the current system, what we have is that by law, people are excluded and prohibited from accessing public goods and services that are essential to their integration and that are that would enable people to integrate and enable us to have a healthier society. The law restricts people to get engaged in those activities and get access to those rights and entitlements that exist for other people, other residents of Scotland. And those include employment, housing and homelessness services, financial, social security, community care, etc. So this causes a level of discrepancy between, in terms of the legal frameworks and policy, and it causes a high level of restriction on Scottish government and Scottish society to rebuild and to help people to rebuild their lives in Scotland. The new bill, what the new bill is introducing is higher levels of restriction on people and a new form of dysfunctionality to the already poorly functioning system, a new form of discrimination and exclusion of people who are subject to the system. It's very easy to imagine that the bill in practice is going to lead to a relatively high level of social confusion and destabilization, both in terms of Scottish public, but especially on public services and the charity sector. It's easy to imagine how it would look like for a huge number of Scottish residents who are new Scots here in pursuit of sanctuary, asylum seekers, to be kept in limbo, in legal limbo, warehoused in asylum camps in a remote area of Scotland with restricted access to, or almost no access to public services, to the job market, to housing and homelessness services, to the mainstream services. There is no way to calculate and imagine that this has any good outcome for Scotland as a society. And that's regardless, that's not to mention how inhumane it is for people who are subject to the system, but thinking socially, there's no way to calculate and come to a conclusion that will have any good outcome for the society. So the new bill is introducing new forms of dysfunctionalities and new forms of exclusion to the already exclusive and this poorly functional system. And it will have consequences for Scotland as a nation, for the public. It will have pressure, it will introduce pressure on public services and on the charity sector. What can be done, I think, what would be the most reasonable approach in Scotland that can be taken is to sit down and think, what can we do as a devolved administration, as people, as a nation, as a society? How can we assess those risks that are going to be imposed soon on Scotland, and how can we mitigate some of those risks? Are there areas that we can legislate in Scottish Parliament or through Scottish government, or are there ways for us to find the policy and legislative mechanisms to increase people's access to those domains of integration that are essential for people to rebuild their lives and for us to build a healthy society together? I believe there are, but it's not that easy when it comes to policy and legislation. But I hope to see the intention to have a collective discussion around what's coming up, what are the risks for the society, and how can we mitigate them through policy and legislation in Scotland. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Dylan. let's move right on to Alison.
Thank you very much indeed, and to Christina and Dylan, thank you also for taking some of what I was going to say, so hopefully I will be well within the 7 minutes. But I wanted to begin with the international context and with this word unprecedented. The word unprecedented is used a lot in a lot of the fundraising materials around asylum reform, and a lot of the public discourse, particularly within the UK, about the numbers coming to the UK and the numbers of people displaced. We see international statistics and UK statistics with the word unprecedented in front of them. Now, my colleague Jeff Crisp, who is the former senior policy officer at UNHCR, repeatedly states in public that the numbers have been more or less steady for many, many years, and that all figures should be treated with caution, and that actually we're not necessarily dealing with unprecedented numbers at the moment of people who are displaced either internally or who are seeking refuge, and that steadiness might change where the emphasis of movements of peoples are, and therefore contextually what needs to happen, but that we should be quite careful when using words which are quite incendiary at times, like unprecedented, and which might create a climate of fear or of panic. Maybe just to give you a few statistics to start with, and I'm not a statistician and I don't normally work in numbers, but I think they're instructive for thinking this through in a global context. UNHCR's 2020 statistics say that 68% of refugees originate from 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. And they are hosted, and 39% are hosted in just 5 countries: Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, and Germany. This discourse of what is unprecedented, particularly coming from countries in the global north, and that has led to interventions like the new Global Compact for refugees, is one where the majority refugee hosting is occurring within what are usually called the countries of the global south. Only Germany is appearing on that list of the top 5 countries, and Germany, as you may remember, took the decision to resettle 1 million Syrian refugees back in 2015-16. I think it's also worth pointing out that 86% of the total that we have, according to the best statistics, are hosted in low to middle income countries. So that the work of refugee hosting, as my colleague Professor Lena Fidian-Kishmeh at the University College London has repeatedly pointed out, is largely undertaken by refugee communities, diaspora communities in the countries of the global south, or in neighbouring countries to those where conflict is being experienced, and that figure is at 73%. My colleague Anne Singleton, who's worked for the International Office of Migration, has also stressed that we must be very cautious when looking at any statistics in this field of global migration, particularly when we're looking at border crossings. And this builds very much on what Christina has been saying. Some countries have very robust mechanisms for counting you in and counting you out, and others do not and may not even have any mechanism for counting you in and counting you out. At borders in conflict, people might cross multiple times. So it's often very difficult to know what the exact numbers are. And that in a context of chaos, then the statistics may or may not tell a story that is useful to us. But nonetheless, what we find in public discourse and in much of public policy, particularly in the rich world countries of the global north, is a discourse that is built upon this word unprecedented. And we found it too in the draft consultation for the new plan for immigration that is now entering its has gone through its second reading and is into committee stage in the UK Parliament. Just going to read one sentence. Left unchecked, illegal immigration puts unsustainable pressures on public services. This system is collapsing under the pressures from what are in effect parallel illegal routes to asylum. Now, those of us who work in language, discourse analysis and the humanities can see that there are words in that statement that are freighted and are doing ideological work. And it's important that that is stated and stated within the academic discipline: unchecked, illegal, unsustainable, collapsing, illegal. And then collocating that word, which means linked to another word, with words like roots or asylum or immigration. Irregular is the term that most of the people working within the asylum systems and legally looking at what constitute irregular routes people have to take because they have no paperwork, have no documentation, would prefer. So I think this builds very much on what my colleague Christina was saying about bluff. And the way in which management by bluff, management by public pronouncement, management by certain forms of discourse is something we've come to see increasingly in what has been termed the hostile environment in the United Kingdom, and that the new plan for immigration really works with that. What arts and humanities scholars like myself bring to this discussion is evidence of the extent to which the use of this language in the UK context, but also in other contexts where this language has been used previously, is what we call performative. It creates what it's describing and brings into being some of those fears, some of those instances by using this kind of language. So it's one of the reasons why the territory of language is so important for us to look at and understand. And it creates quite an emotive environment. And that, I think, is where, particularly within Scotland, it's been very important that the New Scots refugee integration strategy has been built not on emotive language, but on a human rights-based framework. So the New Scots integration framework that Dylan was describing so well is actually rooted in human rights law and human rights legislation. Each of those categories is based alongside one of the articles for human rights in order to ensure that it is rights that are respected, the right to seek asylum, the right to a freedom from fear of persecution that leads to refugee rights. And that integration then builds on rights to housing, rights to dignity, rights to culture, rights to language, rights to employment. And that helps take us out of the emotive context being produced through the bluff that Christina speaks of, through the criminalization that Dylan has been speaking of, and into a context where lawyers can do their work and civil servants can do their work and civil society can do their work in an environment that is steady and normalizing. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. And lastly, we have Joe.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to take a slightly different angle on some of these questions and not address it directly through the analysis of asylum issues. But I'm going to start off with a quotation from somebody who's been writing about the Nationality and Borders Bill, a woman called Emma Harris, who's a barrister in London, specializing in immigration, asylum, and nationality and public law. And she said, those who fight the Nationality and Borders Bill as a whole will no doubt be accused of seeking to delay justice for the Windrush generation and countless others. And that's an interesting proposition to make, and perhaps quite contentious. But I want to demonstrate by briefly talking about those the nationality provisions of the Nationality and Borders Bill and the way in which everything is mixed up. As another example, perhaps of bluff, as Christina calls it, or even as a form of political trickery, if that isn't too emotive a word to use. So why does Emma suggest that fighting the Nationality and Borders Bill is delaying justice for the Windrush generation? This is because what is in the bill, along with what I think many would agree are the egregious and potentially ineffective provisions on asylum and refugee seeking that have already been mentioned by the previous speakers. What the bill contains are a limited number of provisions that correct and engage with various historical anomalies and areas of unfairness in British nationality law and seek to remove them. Now, many of these historical anomalies or changes are things that the government is being forced into by cases that have been brought in the higher courts, both in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK, especially in relation to historical discrimination against men and women, especially in relation to those who are not married, which makes it harder for some people to transmit citizenship to their children. These may only be a small number of cases compared to the vast majority of people who relatively straightforwardly receive birthright citizenship. Obviously, there are many complexities in relation to those who are recent immigrants to the UK, but the whole questions here, many of the questions here are also complexified because of the colonial history of UK nationality law and various statuses that are far too detailed to go into in this context, such as those of British Overseas Territories citizenship and various other post-colonial statuses. But there are also provisions in the bill which apply to the case of Windrush. There are four sets of beneficiaries, and the fourth set of beneficiaries are individuals who were wrongly prevented under the Windrush scandal from returning to the UK after traveling abroad and have now been given the permission to re-enter. However, they can't currently naturalize or register as British citizens because they don't meet the residence requirement for naturalization, as they were not in the UK on the day that fell 5 years before the date of application because of their wrongful exclusion. Unlike other residence requirements, this criterion cannot currently be waived by the Secretary of State, and the bill will permit the Secretary of State to overlook that criteria. Now, there are various general caveats that can be made about those provisions. There's a lot of support amongst informed commentators, such as the Law Society of Scotland, that all forms of registration as British citizen should be free, or at least subject to a fee which isn't profit grifting as current registration processes are. And this is part of this issue is also before the Supreme Court at present. And there's arguably too much discretion for the Secretary of State in some of the provisions that would be modified if the Nationality and Borders Bill goes forward. And again, the Law Society of Scotland suggests that it's important that criteria for the exercise of the Secretary of State's discretion are set out in guidance published by the Home Office. And there are other aspects of the bill that are worrying, that are also in relation to nationality or statelessness. There's an additional requirement for citizenship applications which are made on behalf of stateless children born in the UK, which will be introduced, which may make it more difficult for those children to be recognised as UK citizens. Part of this is that there's a sense that somehow this is being abused. It's yet another of these, as it were, straw people that are set up without any evidence. Here's what the European Network on Statelessness, which is a pan-European civil society network, thinks about this. And after they submitted a detailed response to the proposal set out in the new plan. They cautioned that it was premature to make changes in the absence of more detailed data and evidence on the potential scale of misuse of the route for stateless children. It called on the government to first arrange for a detailed independent study and a comprehensive impact assessment of any potential impact on children in the UK. Its response also commented on the UK's international, regional and domestic legal obligations to consider the best interests of the child and to take steps to reduce and prevent statelessness, and the various ways in which people can encounter barriers to registering a child with authorities in the parent's country of nationality. Think of various states without functioning administrations. Afghanistan, Venezuela are two examples. It's been suggested that the new requirement should be underpinned also by flexible evidential requirements to reflect the fact that in some cases, obtaining certain types of documents might be impossible. So even within the nationality provisions, there's good and there's bad. But overall, the position within Parliament is certainly complicated for those political parties that want to contest the provisions on asylum, who want to use the issue of the current crisis in Afghanistan in order to demonstrate how inappropriate those provisions are, how inapt they are for the type of policy problem which is actually before us, particularly in the global north. But at the same time, do not want to make it harder for the UK to deliver effective redress to the Windrush generation. And this is, I'm afraid, another common technique within lawmaking and policy making in the context of justice and home affairs in the UK. And it's not the first time that we've seen cases like this. It's perhaps another example of the bluff idea that was introduced by Christina and discussed by Alison from a discourse perspective. It shouldn't be hard simply to oppose the asylum provisions of the Nationality Board and Borders Bill. In practice, it's been made more complicated to do that because of the provisions on citizenship. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks to all four of you. In 30 minutes, you've raised a huge number of issues. Now we want to pass things over to the audience and ask you to put any questions or contributions you have in the Q&A. We've had a Scottish dimension to this, and only you've mentioned that the Scottish government and political attitude is rather different. What scope would there be for devolving more of this to Scotland, or indeed, even if Scotland were independent, what scope would there be to do things differently, given that we have open borders and we're part of the common travel area and so on? Delan, you mentioned this. Could you have a go at that one?
Of course, and I think there are, these are two key questions. What does it mean for Scotland now, and what scope there is for Scotland to react, and how within the current context, the way that things are operating now, and what could this mean for an independent Scotland in the future? I think these are two separate but slightly interlinked questions, and there are overlaps in the answers to these two questions. I think what it means for Scotland now and what scope there is for Scotland to react and how within the current context, there is the way that I organize my thinking about this question is that there are the asylum process and the experience of asylum seekers. There are two main parts to it. One of them is asylum determination, which is got to do with your legal status as an asylum seeker. So the Home Office or a government department needs to assess your case and then decide whether you deserve protection in this country and therefore you receive refugee protection or not. Could that be devolved to Scotland? That's a big argument, and it might take too long for it to go anywhere. And whether there is appetite by the Scottish government to argue for it or not is also a question that I don't have the answers to, but the scale of the question about asylum determination when it comes to borders, visa, immigration, the scope of the argument and the complexity is deeper. The other part of the asylum system is integration that relates to, for example, asylum support and accommodation and employment and people's rights and entitlements to public services and goods like other residents. There is much more scope in that argument, and there is much more that Scottish government can, and in my opinion, should maneuver on in terms of, for example, asylum support and accommodation provision, or employment, or social security, or community care. So there is scope, in my opinion, there is more scope for Scotland to legislate or to negotiate and argue for those aspects of asylum system that directly relate to people's ability to integrate, for example, housing and homelessness services, employment, asylum support and accommodation, to be devolved. Although it's not, I do receive a lot of, there's a very legitimate criticism to this point of view, because your legal status, your status as an asylum seeker, directly affects your ability to integrate and your entitlement to access all the other rights that we are talking about. So there is the divide between asylum determination and asylum support and accommodation and other rights and entitlement is not as clear as I'm pointing it out. But I organize it in this way to make it more clear in terms of where we can focus as Scotland and where we can argue and where we can negotiate. I think there are clear and more straightforward arguments and actions that could be taken. And those relate to issues around asylum support and accommodation, for example, to be devolved, housing and homelessness services, employment, community care, social security. These are areas that Scotland can and I think should focus on, legislate, negotiate, and try to argue for them to be devolved to Scotland.
Okay, thanks. Now we're getting questions coming through. I'll take the first one here. Given that in the past a UK asylum application was considered inadmissible if the applicant first travelled through another EU country, what happens now with refugees originating outside the EU coming through the EU? Maybe Joe, you could have a go at that one.
Yes, I can't say a great deal in detail, but as I understand it, being able to make some progress in that area would, because the UK is now outside the EU, would be dependent on the UK reaching some bilateral agreements with various states, particularly with France, and it hasn't made that much progress. So, of course, in that respect, the UK's withdrawal from the EU has made the complexity of asylum policy even greater than it was.
Okay, now we have another one from Sarah Kiambi. Where do the panel see the right locus for action to affect change in asylum? The speakers seem to me to address issues at different levels, global, Scotland, the UK. I'd be interested to hear thoughts on how one can think through which level may be the most effective. How could one think through the interlinkages between the different levels of government? That's a little bit my question, but not quite the same. So would somebody like to have a go at that one? Christina, say?
Okay, I can make a start. Thanks, Sarah. That's an interesting and challenging question. I mean, I'm just thinking about the pressure points in a way. So what factors might influence government decision making in this area? And I can think of two. If I've got my optimistic hat on, which is quite rarely at the moment. One, I think, is public opinion. So I think there are episodes which can really galvanize public opinion to sort of direct government or steer governments towards at least signaling a more generous approach towards refugees. And there have been episodes in the context of the European refugee crisis, if we want to use that term. And I think more recently with Afghanistan, there is potential. I think there's a groundswell of, because of the way the media is reporting it, of sympathy and concern about the plight of Afghan refugees at the moment. So that could be something which can be tapped and mobilized. And the other one is, on the international stage, governments do worry about their reputation and how they appear, and whether they're appearing to be progressive and generous and liberal and human rights respecting. So again, that is another way to sort of, especially if you take the discourse, and here again we're going into Alison's sort of the language question. If you take the discourse on global Britain, in a sense, to sort of put a mirror to the government and say, well, you want global Britain, you want to be a respected leader. How are you demonstrating this through your asylum policy? I'm not sure that quite answers your question, Sarah, but I'm just, it's difficult, but I think we need to think about the types of arguments and types of sort of forms of reasoning that might exercise some traction on the government.
Could I maybe follow on from Christina? Because I think it's such a great question, Sarah, and it's the one that keeps me awake most nights, trying to think about how we might effect change such that everyone can live in a just and orderly society. In other words, to live in peace, but a peace that is founded in the basis of justice and in the rule of law, and how I see these threats at the moment to those and to that ability. And I think there's a number of things that we can point to that interlink and intersect. In 2015, in May, there was an opinion poll done before the general election that said that 7% of the UK population thought that we should have more asylum seekers. After the publication of the photograph of Aylan Kurdi, the Kurdish refugee who was washed up on a beach in Turkey, that figure went up to 47%, and it has never gone back down to 7%. So that was an intervention through the arts and humanities. A photograph changed people's minds worldwide, and it brought about a moment, not so much of a great increase in the amount of hosting that went on, though quite a bit did happen, and not even necessarily to a change of heart by nation states, but it did lead to an immense amount of capacity building within communities that wanted to host, be they refugee hosts or be they people in civil society. To put it another way, people like my mum started volunteering. And we then watched as people moved from having an understanding of this work as charity, as giving things, things they didn't want anymore, things they wanted to discard, to refugee charities to help equip flats, to then realizing something about the levels of injustice and engaging more politically with their MPs, with their representatives. We've gone from a situation where the Scottish Refugee Council in 2015, and Dylan knows this well because I remember him coming and knocking on my door at the university and saying, oh my goodness, the people who want to volunteer, what are we going to do with all these people? It's amazing. To 400 people instantly knowing that what they needed to do was engage at a national level with their representatives. So capacity has been built across society already, and that's building constantly through different initiatives within civil society and through the way that we're changed by encounter. I think that then does move up to the kinds of levels, that I engage with through UNESCO, but which are also part of things like the Global Compact for Refugees. That has come because of this word burden sharing, the view that it's not okay that the countries that I was mentioning are doing the majority of the work and yet are often countries who have very little resource. So there is something there in the Global Compact. Ease the pressure on host countries, enhance refugee self-reliance, expand access to third country solutions, support conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity, so peace building and post-conflict. All of these things I think are really important. The issue with the Global Compact is it needs to be taken seriously. Same issue with the Refugee Convention. We need to keep the pressure on, and I think this is a constant issue for it to be respected. We've got the agreement there, we need to continue with it. So I think these things intersect. And I watch my mum as a barometer, going from maybe giving an aid package or a food package to then getting much more involved in some of the political campaigning and then seeing these changes in these ways. So I think these things interlink in that way.
Thank you. There's a question from Nazir Mir, but I think it's largely being covered by what you've all said, but we may come back to it at the end if we have time. There's another question here. Do members of the panel differentiate between asylum seekers, refugees, and economic migrants? Who would like to have a go at that one?
I can answer that one.
Yeah.
A migrant is a person who migrates, right? An asylum seeker and a refugee is a person who's migrated for a specific purpose. What makes definition of an asylum seeker or refugee is a person who arrives in a country, in a safe country like the UK, and applies for asylum and seeks protection due to a well-founded fear of persecution for different reasons. Once that application is ongoing, the person is seeking asylum, therefore asylum seeker. Once that protection is granted, the person's status becomes a refugee. That person is also a migrant because they've migrated. An economic migrant is a person who migrates for economic purposes. Now, I came to the UK and submitted an asylum claim because I had a well-founded fear of persecution, and I got my protection, and then I became a refugee. So I've been on all these labels. Did I have an economic motive? Did I want to work in the UK and make money and make a healthy economic life for myself and contribute to the economy of the country? Of course. Is that a bad thing? No. Does that make me an economic migrant as well as a refugee and asylum seeker? I don't know. I'll leave it for you to answer. But what I'm trying to get to is that we can't put people in those kind of boxes so discreetly and distinctively, because economy or work, employment, financial stability, and contributing to the economy of the receiving country is part of my identity and job and life, as well as every other asylum seeker and refugee. So differentiation between, so just because I am a refugee, I'm therefore have no economic role or motivation or part in my life is not that clear. But there is a clear definition for a person who's seeking refugee protection.
Well, we have another question specifically addressed to you, Ilan. Do you perhaps believe that COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the Scottish asylum process, in which asylums and migrants had an increase of their weekly benefits being cut, encountering severe mental well-being issues? I think it's really about the impact of the COVID on the situation of migrants and asylum seekers.
That's right. I think the COVID experience exposed the level of inequality in our society on different marginalized groups, including and in particular on people who seek asylum in Scotland. And what we saw, sadly, it exposed the level of dysfunctionality of mainly asylum support and accommodation provision system that we have in place. So at the moment, the system that we have in place, as I mentioned in my opening talk, is that we have a system that takes people effectively and systemically and deliberately out of the mainstream services. So prohibits people from accessing mainstream housing, homelessness, employment, financial support, etc., and puts them in a separate system that is delivered and contracted to private companies. So the asylum support and accommodation is contracted to private companies to be provided to asylum seekers. So people don't have access to DWP, to social work, to all the other social protection that exists for residents. And all those duties of care are contracted to private companies. So that system is was exposed during COVID, and it showed that the level of scrutiny and accountability and protection that the existing mainstream services provide to people is impossible to secure in the current system that is contracted to private companies. The consequences of this was very visible. So in Scotland, for example, the issues around hotel accommodations and institutional accommodation and financial cut to people led to severe consequences, led to people being dead in those hotels, suicides and stabbing attacks and a police officer injured, etc. So it has severe visible consequences for the city in Glasgow, the society, but also for people who are subject in that system. And it really exposed the level of dysfunctionality and the consequences of that dysfunctionality to the society. And I think now we have a moment of reflection. Now it's time to look at what went wrong in asylum support and accommodation during COVID in Scotland and why. What's the system in play that allows for those kind of dysfunctionalities? What lessons can we learn? And what can we change in the future to make sure that those behaviors and those actions and those decisions are not made again? But in general, I think there are great lessons to be learned, and there is great, there are deep reflections and investigations and learnings to be made by all of us using the COVID experience as a case study.
Thanks. Now we're coming to the end of our time. We've only got 5 minutes left and there are no more questions here, but I'd just like to go around the panel and ask you for any final thoughts on this in the light of what's been said and what the others have said, starting with Joe.
Thank you very much. I have nothing further to say. I'll donate my time, but thank you very much to the FRSE for this and for the excellent questions that have come from the audience.
Okay. Christina?
I think really just to highlight the sort of complex picture created by the sort of tension between the Scottish government approach and UK government approach. And I think to watch that space and see how it evolves now in the context of a debate around constitutional change and broader political debates, I think is a really fascinating set of issues and very important.
Yeah. Alison?
I just want to finish maybe by highlighting something positive that builds on what Christina was just saying and some of the work that Dylan and others were involved in, which was around voting rights. Refugees had the right to vote in the elections in Scotland of late. And it wasn't just refugees who had the right to vote who weren't included previously. There was work done to include many others, categories who'd previously been excluded. And I think this approach of saying, what is good for asylum seekers in terms of inclusion in society will be good for other areas and other people who have been traditionally disadvantaged. So that the move to have a housing policy that mitigates against homelessness, in which the homelessness that has been present within the asylum community is also mitigated, is a really excellent approach. And voting rights for me instantiated that. And I would want very much to see our work in this area with Scottish Government be about those kinds of forms of inclusion, because maybe to cite Behrouz Bachani, when who was held captive on Manus Island before being granted asylum by New Zealand, he said that a lot of his work and the work that Australians did with him was very much about trying to make Australia a better country. And I think that this is one of the areas of social engagement and social endeavour where you see people trying to make things better for everyone, but from this particular point of identified injustice.
Okay, so thanks to the four speakers and for the audience for their questions. This is a debate that's going to continue. The RSE is doing a lot of work around this, so look out for our various publications, our representations to parliaments and governments at various levels, and to continuing to debate this. I do hope to see you all next year, hopefully in person. So thank you once again, and good afternoon.